The cold doesn't ask permission to take everything from you. It simply waits, patient and inevitable, until you make your first mistake. Thomas pressed his mittened hand against the frozen canvas of the tent and felt the wind pushing back. Outside, the Arctic dawn was breaking across the endless white, painting the horizon in shades of silver and pale blue. He could hear the others stirring behind him, their breath creating small clouds in the frigid air despite the shelter. "We need to move soon," he said quietly, his voice rough from the cold. Margaret sat up in her sleeping bag, her face framed by the fur-lined hood of her parka. After 3 weeks on the ice, her features had grown sharper, more weathered, but her eyes remained clear and focused. "How's the wind?" she asked. "Steady, from the northeast. It'll be at our backs if we keep heading west." She nodded and began the careful process of emerging from her sleeping bag without letting the precious warmth escape too quickly. Every movement in the Arctic required thought. Every action had consequences. The third member of their party, William, was already awake and melting snow for their morning tea. The small spirit stove hissed softly, a sound that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats. He was the youngest of them, at 28, but his experience on the ice matched theirs. Before this expedition, he'd spent 2 winters on a whaling ship in these same waters. "We made good distance yesterday," William said, not looking up from his desk. 8 miles, maybe 9. Thomas pulled on his boots, checking each lace carefully. "If the weather holds, we might reach the cache by tomorrow evening." The cache was everything now. 6 days ago, they'd been forced to abandon half their supplies when a pressure ridge had opened beneath their sledge, swallowing their heaviest equipment into the dark water below. They'd managed to save themselves and 1 sledge, but the loss had changed everything about their journey. Now they were racing against their remaining supplies, pushing toward a depot they'd established 2 months earlier on their way north. If they reached it, they would have enough food and fuel to make it back to the ship. If they didn't, but Thomas didn't let himself think about that. The tea was ready, bitter and hot. They drank it slowly, letting the warmth spread through their bodies. Margaret divided their breakfast ration with practiced precision. 6 biscuits each, a strip of dried seal meat, a handful of pemmican. It wasn't much, but it would keep them moving. "Ready?" Thomas asked when they'd finished. The others nodded. They packed the tent with the efficiency of people who'd done this hundreds of times. Every item had its place. Every strap was checked twice. On the ice, carelessness killed faster than the cold. As soon as the dawn became paler, the travelers moved forward, attentive in the snow, their forms small against the vast white expanse.
The sledge runners sang against the ice, a high, steady note that marked their progress. Thomas pulled from the front, with Margaret and William pushing from behind in the sides. The load was lighter now, after their loss, but the terrain made every mile hard-earned. The ice here was old and rough, broken into blocks and ridges by years of freezing and thawing. They had to navigate carefully, searching for paths that wouldn't tip the sledge or snap a runner. Sometimes they moved 100 yards, only to hit an impassable barrier and have to backtrack, but they kept moving. The sun climbed slowly, never rising high this far north in late autumn. It traced a low arc across the southern sky, casting long shadows that turned every ridge into a maze of light and darkness. The temperature had dropped during the night. Thomas estimated it was around 30 below zero, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. They walked in silence mostly, saving their breath for the work. But there was comfort in the sound of their footsteps, the creak of the sledge, the rhythm of their breathing. They were alive. They were moving forward. For now, that was enough. Around midday, they stopped for a brief rest. William pulled out his compass and took a reading, comparing it with the one from their morning start. Margaret examined the runners on the sledge, checking for cracks or damage. Thomas climbed a nearby pressure ridge to scan the route ahead. What he saw made his heart sink. Stretching across their path, perhaps 2 miles distant, was a massive field of broken ice. From his elevated position, he could see blocks the size of houses tilted at impossible angles, their edges sharp and blue-white in the pale light. The field extended as far as he could see to the north and south. They would have to cross it. There was no other way. "What do you see?" Margaret called up to him. Thomas climbed back down carefully. "Rough ice ahead. Very rough. It's going to slow us down." William frowned, calculating in his head. How much? "Could take us a full day to get through, maybe more." They stood in silence for a moment, considering what this meant for their supplies, their timeline, their chances. But there was no point in dwelling on problems they couldn't solve. They had a route to walk and daylight to walk it in. "We'll manage," Margaret said simply. They continued on. The wind picked up as the afternoon progressed, driving crystals of ice against their faces. Thomas pulled his scarf higher, leaving only his eyes exposed. The cold found every gap in their clothing, every opening where fabric met skin. It was the kind of cold that made breathing hurt, that turned moisture in your lungs to frost. But they'd faced worse. Each of them carried memories of nights when the temperature had dropped to 50 below, when the wind had tried to tear their tent apart, when dawn had seemed like it might never come.
Those experiences had taught them that the human body could endure far more than the mind believed possible. The key was to keep moving, keep warm, keep believing there was a tomorrow worth reaching. They reached the edge of the broken ice field as the sun began its descent. Thomas called a halt while there was still enough light to set up camp properly. The tent went up quickly, staked firmly into the ice. Inside, they arranged their sleeping bags and began the evening routine. William started the stove. Margaret organized their remaining supplies, counting and recounting to make sure they had what she thought they had. Thomas recorded their position and the day's progress in his journal, his fingers clumsy with cold despite the mittens. 7 miles today, he announced. Not bad given the terrain. We'll need to make better distance tomorrow, Margaret said. She didn't need to explain why. They all understood the mathematics of their situation. Dinner was similar to breakfast, but slightly smaller portions. They ate slowly, making the food last, trying to feel satisfied on rations designed to keep them functional rather than full. Afterward, they boiled more snow for tea and sat drinking it while the stove's warmth slowly transformed the tent's interior from painful cold to merely uncomfortable. "Tell me something about home," William said suddenly. It was a game they played sometimes when the silence grew too heavy. They would take turns sharing memories, small stories from the world they'd left behind. It reminded them that this frozen wilderness wasn't the only world that existed, that somewhere far to the south, life continued in colors other than white and blue. Margaret spoke first. "There's a bakery near my flat in London. On Sunday mornings, you can smell the bread baking from 2 streets away. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, she always adds an extra currant bun to your order if she likes you." "Did she like you?" William asked. "I don't know. I never counted the buns," Margaret smiled slightly. "I just ate them and felt grateful." Thomas stared at the stove's blue flame. "My sister has 3 children now. The youngest, Emma, she's learning to play piano. Before I left, she played for me. Chopsticks, over and over. She was so proud of herself." "Do you miss it?" William asked. "The noise, the warmth, the normal things?" Thomas considered this carefully. "Yes and no. This," he gestured around the tent, at the ice beyond, "this is also real, maybe more real than those other things. Out here, everything matters. Every decision, every action. There's a clarity to that." William nodded slowly. "I understand that, though I could do with slightly less clarity and slightly more of Mrs. Patterson's currant buns." They laughed together, the sound strange and precious in the frozen darkness. But even as they laughed, Thomas couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. The broken ice field ahead would cost them time they couldn't afford to lose.
And beyond that, there would be other obstacles, other delays. The cache they were racing towards suddenly seemed very far away. He kept these thoughts to himself. Fear, like heat, was a resource that shouldn't be wasted. They woke to the sound of wind against canvas, steady and relentless. Thomas emerged from his sleeping bag and lit the candle they kept for morning light. The tent walls rippled and snapped, and through the fabric he could hear the deep groan of moving ice somewhere in the distance. "Storm coming?" William asked sleepily. "Maybe, or maybe just wind." Thomas began the process of getting dressed, pulling on the layers that would keep him alive in the cold. "We should move as soon as we can." They ate a quick breakfast and broke camp efficiently. Outside, the world was the same endless white it had been yesterday, but the wind had erased their tracks from the previous evening. It was as if they'd never been here, as if the ice had swallowed all evidence of their passage. The broken ice field loomed ahead, even more daunting in the morning light. Up close, the individual blocks rose like walls, some 20 feet high or more. Blue ice, old ice, harder than stone and just as unforgiving. Between the blocks were narrow channels and gaps, some filled with loose snow, others showing the dark water beneath. "We'll need to scout ahead," Thomas said. "Find a path through before we try to bring the sledge." Margaret nodded. "I'll go. You two rest." Before Thomas could protest, she was already moving forward, testing each step carefully. They watched her climb up and over the first ridge, her red parka a small spot of color against the white. Then she disappeared from view. The minutes stretched out. Thomas and William waited by the sledge, not speaking. Around them, the ice field creaked and groaned, ancient sounds that spoke of pressures and forces beyond human comprehension. This ice had been forming for thousands of years, layer upon layer, season upon season. Against such age, their journey seemed impossibly brief. Margaret returned 20 minutes later, slightly out of breath. "There's a way through. It's not easy, but it's possible. We'll need to rope the sledge down one section, maybe two. And there's water visible in a few places, so we'll have to be careful." "Show us," Thomas said. They spent the next 4 hours working the sledge through the broken ice. It was exhausting, dangerous work. They had to lift and lever the sledge over obstacles, lower it carefully down steep faces, navigate around blocks that looked stable but might collapse at any moment. Several times they heard the crack of breaking ice and had to freeze, waiting to see if the surface beneath them would hold. But slowly, yard by yard, they made progress. Margaret led the way, finding the path and marking it so they could follow safely. William manned the ropes, controlling the sledge's descent on the steeper sections.
Thomas pushed and pulled from wherever he was needed most, throwing his weight against the sledge's weight, refusing to let it tip or slide into danger. By early afternoon, they were halfway through. Thomas called a brief halt so they could rest and assess their situation. They were all breathing hard, sweating despite the cold. The physical work generated heat, but they couldn't afford to get too wet. Sweat that froze against your skin was a death sentence in the Arctic. "Water," Margaret said, pointing. In a gap between two large blocks, they could see dark water moving slowly, a lead that had opened in the ice. It was perhaps 10 feet wide, extending away to the north and south. They would have to find a way around it or across it. Thomas examined the lead carefully. The ice on either side looked stable, but appearances meant nothing in this environment. Ice that seemed solid could be rotten underneath, ready to collapse at the slightest weight. "We'll test it," he said finally, carefully. They uncoiled their safety rope, tying one end around Thomas's waist. If the ice broke and he fell through, Margaret and William would have a chance to pull him out before the cold water killed him. Not a good chance, but a chance. Thomas moved forward slowly, distributing his weight, testing each step before committing to it. The ice held. He crossed the narrowest part of the lead, where the gap was perhaps 8 feet wide, and reached the far side safely. Then he pulled the rope tight and signaled for them to send the sledge across. This was the dangerous part. The sledge was heavy, and all its weight would be concentrated on the runners. If the ice broke... But it didn't. The sledge crossed safely, and then Margaret and William followed, moving quickly once they saw the route was sound. They rested for a moment on the far side, allowing their racing hearts to slow. These small victories were what kept them going. Each obstacle overcome was proof they could overcome the next one. "How much further through this field?" William asked. Margaret consulted her mental map. "Another mile, maybe 2. If we keep this pace, we should be clear by evening." They pushed on. The afternoon sun cast the ice field in shades of blue and gold, beautiful and deadly. Thomas found himself appreciating the stark beauty of it even as he fought to navigate through it. This was a world few people would ever see, a landscape of such extreme conditions that it pushed human endurance to its absolute limit. And yet, here they were, 3 people moving through it step by careful step. They emerged from the broken ice field just as the sun touched the horizon. Beyond the chaos of blocks and ridges, the ice smoothed out into a more even surface, though still far from flat. But compared to what they'd just crossed, it looked like a highway. Thomas felt a surge of relief so strong it almost made him dizzy. They'd done it. They'd made it through. "We'll camp here," he said. Then he caught it, a small dark shape, slightly elevated, perhaps 2 miles distant. The cache. They'd marked it with a tall pole and black flag before they'd headed north. From this distance it was barely visible, but it was there. They'd found it. "That's it," Thomas said, and he couldn't keep the relief out of his voice. "That's our cache." They didn't run toward it. Running on the ice was a good way to fall through a hidden weakness or turn an ankle. But they did pick up their pace, moving with new energy and purpose. The cache meant safety. It meant supplies. It meant they would make it home. As they got closer, Thomas could make out more details. The pole was still standing straight, the black flag snapping in a breeze they couldn't feel yet. The cache itself was a mound covered with snow, the supply boxes buried to protect them from the weather. They reached it just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Thomas approached the cache with something like reverence.
This pile of supplies represented survival. It was the difference between life and death, success and failure. "Help me dig it out," he said. They worked quickly, shoveling away the snow that had accumulated over the cache. Beneath the snow were the boxes they'd buried 2 months ago, sealed against the weather and the cold. Thomas's hands shook slightly as he opened the first box. Inside were tins of food, bags of biscuits, tea, sugar, fuel for their stove, more than they dared hope for. All of it intact, all of it untouched by the ice and cold. "We did it," Margaret said softly. "We actually did it." William was already opening another box, cataloging its contents. "This is enough to get us back to the ship with rations to spare. We're going to make it." They stood there for a moment, the three of them, looking at the supplies they'd been racing toward for days. The relief was overwhelming. They'd faced the broken ice, the loss of half their equipment, the constant calculation of dwindling resources, and they'd won. But Thomas knew better than to celebrate too early. They still had to get back to the ship, still had to cross miles of uncertain ice. The journey wasn't over. "Let's camp here tonight," he said. "Reorganize our supplies, rest properly. Tomorrow we start back." They set up the tent near the cache, and for the first time in days, they ate a full meal. Not the carefully rationed portions they'd been surviving on, but a proper dinner with enough food to feel satisfied. The warmth in their bellies felt like luxury. The knowledge that there was more food in the boxes outside felt like wealth. That night, they talked about the route back to the ship. They would retrace their steps roughly, but with full supplies, they could take a more direct path where possible. Thomas estimated they could reach the ship in 10 days, maybe 12 if the weather turned bad. "We'll need to cache some supplies along the way," Margaret suggested.
"In case anyone else comes this way, or if we need them next year." It was the kind of forward thinking that separated experienced Arctic travelers from novices. You didn't just think about your current journey, you thought about the next one, and the one after that. You built systems of support that could save lives years in the future. "Agreed," Thomas said. "We'll leave a cache at the halfway point. Mark it clearly." They talked and planned until the cold forced them into their sleeping bags. But unlike the previous nights, sleep came easily now. The worst was behind them. They had supplies, they had a route, they had a real chance of making it home. The next 10 days passed in a blur of white ice and gray sky. They walked from dawn until dusk, covering distance with steady determination. The weather stayed mostly clear, with only one day of heavy snow that forced them to remain in the tent and wait it out. They established their halfway cache on the 5th day, burying supplies and marking them with another tall pole and black flag. Then they continued on, the sledge lighter now, but still heavy enough to require all their strength. The ice changed as they moved south, becoming smoother in some places, more broken in others. They crossed leads on bridges of ice, navigated pressure ridges, detoured around areas where the ice looked uncertain. Each day brought new challenges, but also brought them closer to safety. On the 8th day, they saw birds. It was William who spotted her first, 3 dark shapes wheeling against the gray sky. "Gulls," he said, pointing. "We must be getting close to open water." Birds meant the edge of the pack ice. Birds meant the ocean. Birds meant the ship. They pushed harder that day, covering nearly 10 miles despite the rough ice. That night, camping in their tent, they could hear the distant sound of water moving, the ocean's voice carrying across the ice. "Tomorrow," Thomas said. "We should see the ship tomorrow." But he was careful not to let hope become certainty. The ice could still kill them. The weather could still turn. They were close, but close wasn't the same as safe. They set out before dawn, wanting to make the most of the available light. The ice became more broken as they approached the edge of the pack, forcing them to navigate carefully. Several times they had to backtrack and find new routes, but they kept moving forward. Around midday, Margaret called out, "There! Do you see it?" In the distance, rising above the broken ice, was a dark shape. Rectangular, solid, man-made. The ship. They'd found it. They didn't run, but they walked faster than was strictly safe, picking their way over the rough ice toward that blessed sight. As they got closer, Thomas could make out more details. The ship was locked in the ice as they'd left it, but it looked whole and undamaged. Smoke rose from the galley stove. Figures moved on deck. Someone spotted them and called out,
More figures appeared.
Soon the entire crew was at the rail, waving and shouting. The sound of human voices, of celebration, of welcome, carried across the ice like music. They reached the ship an hour later, and hands reached down to help them aboard. Thomas felt the solid deck beneath his feet and had to steady himself. It felt wrong somehow, after so many weeks on moving ice, to stand on something that didn't shift and groan. The captain, a grizzled veteran named Roberts, gripped Thomas's hand firmly. "We'd begun to worry. You were gone longer than planned." "We ran into difficulties," Thomas said simply, "but we made it." That night, aboard the ship, clean and warm and fed properly for the first time in weeks, Thomas sat in the captain's cabin and wrote in his journal. He recorded the details of their journey, the distances covered, the obstacles overcome. But he also wrote about the small moments, the way the sun looked on the ice at dawn, the sound of the sledge runners, the feeling of reaching the cache and knowing they would survive. Margaret and William were somewhere below decks, probably asleep already. They'd all need days to recover fully, to regain the weight they'd lost, to let their bodies heal from the constant stress of the Arctic environment. But they'd done it. They'd made a journey that many would have considered impossible. They'd faced the ice and survived. The following weeks passed in a strange mixture of rest and preparation. The ship remained locked in the ice, waiting for spring and open water. Thomas and his companions recovered slowly, their bodies adjusting back to regular meals and the relative warmth of the ship's interior. Other members of the crew had been conducting their own explorations and research during the months the ship had been frozen in. Scientists measured the ice thickness, recorded temperatures, studied the wildlife. Hunters brought in fresh seal meat to supplement their supplies. Everyone contributed to the expedition's goals and to their collective survival. Thomas spent his days organizing the notes and samples they'd collected during their journey north. They'd achieved their objective, reaching a point further north than any previous expedition in this region. The data they'd gathered would be valuable to future explorers and to the scientific community. But more than that, they'd proven something about human endurance and determination. They'd shown that careful planning, mutual support, and respect for the environment could allow people to survive in conditions that seemed utterly hostile to life. One evening, about 2 weeks after their return, Margaret found Thomas on deck. He was watching the sun set over the ice, painting the frozen landscape in shades of orange and purple. "Thinking about going back out there?" she asked. Thomas smiled. "Part of me is, yes. Is that crazy?" "No crazier than it was the first time." She leaned against the rail beside him. "There's something about the ice. It gets into you."
Even when you're warm and safe, you remember the clarity of it, the simplicity. "The danger," Thomas added. That too. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the colors fade from the sky. Finally, Margaret spoke again. "William and I have been talking. When we get back to England, we're thinking about planning another expedition. Different region, different goals, but similar in spirit. Would you be interested?" Thomas considered this carefully. The rational part of his mind said he should be done with Arctic exploration, that he'd been lucky to survive this time and shouldn't push that luck. But the part of him that had walked across the ice, that had felt the wild freedom of that frozen world, wanted to go back. "Yes," he said finally, "I'd be interested." Margaret nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "Good. The ice isn't done with us yet." Spring came slowly to the Arctic. The days grew longer, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the ice began its annual transformation. Leads opened in the pack ice, creating dark channels of water. The ship groaned and shifted as the ice that held it began to break up. In early June, Captain Roberts made the call. "We'll be leaving within the week," he announced. "Start preparing for departure." The crew moved with practice efficiency, securing equipment, checking the rigging, making sure everything was ready for the journey south. After months locked in the ice, the ship would soon be free. On their last evening in the ice, Thomas walked out onto the frozen surface one final time. The ice that had been solid enough to walk on for months was now clearly weakening. Dark patches showed where water was working its way to the surface. The leads were wider, the connections between ice flows more tenuous. He thought about their journey to the cache and back. Every step they'd taken on this ice was now gone, erased by time and movement.
The broken ice field they'd struggled through had probably shifted and changed beyond recognition. The cache they'd established would eventually be swallowed by the ice or carried out to sea. Nothing in the Arctic was permanent. Everything moved, changed, transformed, except for the cold itself, which was eternal. "Ready to go home?" asked William, walking up beside him. "Ready," Thomas said. "But I'll remember this, all of it. The good parts or the hard parts? Both. You can't have one without the other." The ship broke free of the ice 3 days later. Thomas stood at the rail and watched the frozen landscape slide past as they made their way south through increasingly open water. The ice that had been their world for so long gradually receded, replaced by gray ocean and gray sky. But the memory of it stayed sharp and clear. The cold, the beauty, the clarity, the way every moment had mattered, every decision had consequences.
The ice had stripped away everything unnecessary and shown them what they were capable of when survival depended on working together and refusing to give up. They reached England in August, returning to a world that felt overwhelming after the simplicity of the ice. The noise, the crowds, the heat, everything seemed excessive and slightly unreal. Thomas spent weeks writing his reports, delivering lectures about their expedition, answering questions from scientists and journalists. People wanted to know about the dramatic moments, the dangerous situations, the near-death experiences. But Thomas found himself talking more about the quiet moments, the daily routine of Arctic travel, the way the ice taught you patience and respect. One afternoon in September, he received a letter from Margaret. She and William had secured funding for another expedition, this one to explore the Antarctic coast. Would he join them? Thomas read the letter twice, then walked to the window of his London flat. Outside, people hurried past on cobblestone streets. Vendors called out their wares. Carriages rattled by. Life continued in all its chaotic complexity. But in his mind, he could still see the ice stretching to the horizon, still feel the cold air in his lungs, still hear the sound of sled runners singing over the snow. He sat down and wrote his reply, 3 words that would determine the next chapter of his life. Count me in. The Antarctic expedition wouldn't depart for another year, giving Thomas time to prepare both physically and mentally. He spent his days gathering equipment, studying maps of the southern ice, and corresponding with others who had experience in polar regions. But he also spent time simply living in the temperate world, appreciating things he'd taken for granted before the Arctic. The ability to walk outside without layering on protective clothing, the luxury of fresh food, the simple comfort of being warm. These months of preparation allowed him to process what he'd experienced on the ice. The journey to the cache and back had tested him in ways he was still understanding. He'd learned things about himself, about his capacity for endurance, his ability to make decisions under pressure, his willingness to trust others with his life. He'd also learned about the nature of extreme environments. The Arctic wasn't trying to kill you. It simply existed in a state that was incompatible with human life. Survival required accepting this fact and adapting to it rather than fighting against it. You couldn't conquer the ice. You could only learn to move through it with respect and caution. Margaret and William shared these reflections. The 3 of them met regularly to plan the new expedition, but also to talk about what they'd experienced. Each of them had been changed by the ice, shaped by the constant presence of danger and the absolute necessity of cooperation.
"I don't think I really understood myself before," William said during one of these meetings. "Not completely. On the ice, you can't hide from who you are. You can't pretend to be stronger or braver than you actually are. Everything becomes clear." Margaret nodded. "That's the gift of it, I think. The clarity. Even though it's terrifying, there's something pure about an environment where your survival depends entirely on good judgment and hard work." Thomas understood exactly what they meant. In civilization, with all its comforts and cushions against danger, it was easy to drift through life without really engaging with it. But on the ice, every moment was vivid and immediate. You were completely alive because the alternative was completely dead. This was what would draw them back to polar exploration again and again. Not a death wish, but the opposite, a desire to feel fully alive, to test themselves against the harshest environments on Earth, to prove that humans could survive and even thrive in places that seemed designed to exclude them. Winter in England was mild compared to the Arctic, but Thomas found himself restless as the temperature dropped and the days grew shorter. His body remembered a different kind of cold, a cold so intense it redefined what cold meant. Regular winter weather seemed almost warm by comparison. He continued his preparations, testing equipment, practicing with new navigation instruments, studying the journals of previous Antarctic explorers. The southern ice was different from the northern ice, different patterns, different challenges, different dangers, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Respect the environment, plan carefully, never take unnecessary risks, work together. As the departure date approached, Thomas felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety building in him. He knew what he was getting into this time. He knew about the cold that penetrated every defense, the isolation that could drive men mad, the constant physical strain that wore you down day after day. But he also knew about the beauty, the way sunrise looked on ice that had never seen a human footprint, the profound silence of the polar regions, broken only by wind and the creaking of the ice, the sense of achievement that came from overcoming challenges that pushed you to your absolute limit. 2 days before they were scheduled to depart, Thomas visited his sister Emma and her family. She was older now, her children growing up fast. The youngest, who had played chopsticks on the piano before his first expedition, was now working on more complex pieces. "You're really going back," Emma said. It wasn't a question. "I am." "Why? You nearly died last time. You could stay here, be safe, be comfortable." Thomas considered how to explain it. "Do you remember," he said finally, "how you felt the first time you played a difficult piece of music all the way through without mistakes?"
That sense of accomplishment, of having overcome something hard? Emma nodded. The ice is like that, but more so. It asks everything of you. And if you can give it, if you can meet its demands, you discover capabilities you didn't know you had. You become more than you were. Or you die trying, Emma said quietly. Yes, or that. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Emma hugged him tightly. "Come back safe," she whispered. "Please come back safe." "I'll do my best," Thomas promised. It was the only promise he could make. The ship that would take them to Antarctica was larger and more modern than the one they'd used for the Arctic expedition. It had been specially reinforced to handle the ice, with a double hull and a powerful engine. The crew was experienced, having made several trips to southern waters already. Thomas, Margaret, and William boarded in London on a gray morning in October. The dock was crowded with well-wishers, journalists, and curious onlookers. People called out encouragement and questions. Cameras flashed. A military band played patriotic songs. But Thomas was only half aware of the commotion. His mind was already moving south, already planning and preparing for the challenges ahead. The journey by ship would take several months, crossing the Atlantic, rounding Cape Horn, then pushing south through increasingly rough seas toward the Antarctic coast. They would reach the ice in January, during the Antarctic summer when the ice was most accessible. Then they would have several months to conduct their exploration before winter forced them to either retreat or establish a permanent camp and overwinter. The plan was ambitious but achievable. They would map sections of coastline that had never been properly surveyed, collect scientific samples, and push inland as far as conditions allowed. If everything went well, they might even reach the South Pole itself. But Thomas knew better than to plan that far ahead. The ice had taught him to focus on the immediate challenge, the next step, the current day. Long-term goals were fine as aspirations, but survival required attention to present conditions. The ship cast off its moorings and began moving down the Thames toward the sea. Thomas stood at the rail, watching England recede into the mist. Beside him, Margaret and William were silent, lost in their own thoughts. "No turning back now," William said finally. "Was there ever?" Margaret asked. They looked at each other and smiled. They were committed now, for better or worse. The ice was calling them back, and they were answering that call. The voyage south was long but uneventful. They crossed the equator in November, enjoying a few weeks of tropical warmth before the temperatures began dropping again as they approached Cape Horn. The seas grew rougher, the winds stronger, the sky gray and threatening.
But the ship handled the conditions well, and Captain Stevens was experienced in these waters.
They rounded the Horn successfully and began the final push south toward Antarctica. As they crossed into Antarctic waters, the temperature dropped dramatically. Ice appeared in the water, first as scattered chunks, then as larger floes, then as massive icebergs that towered above the ship. The color of the sea changed from blue to gray to nearly black, and the sky took on a peculiar quality that seemed to intensify the light. "There," the lookout called one morning in early January, "land ahead." Thomas rushed to the rail with the others. In the distance, barely visible through the mist and snow, was a dark shape. Not ice, but rock, the Antarctic coast. They'd made it. The ship approached the coast carefully, navigating through the ice floes. As they got closer, the scale of the landscape became apparent. Massive glaciers flowed down from interior mountains, calving icebergs into the sea with thunderous crashes. Penguins dotted the ice in their thousands. The air was filled with their calls and the cries of seabirds. This was a different world from the Arctic. No polar bears, no indigenous people, no history of human habitation, just ice and rock and wildlife that had never learned to fear humans. Captain Stevens found a relatively protected bay and anchored the ship. "This is as far as I can take you," he said. "From here, you go by sledge and on foot." Thomas, Margaret, and William spent the next week preparing for their inland journey. They unloaded supplies, organized equipment, and tested their sledges on the coastal ice. The weather was unpredictable, with sudden storms that could appear out of nowhere and winds strong enough to knock a person off their feet. But they'd faced these conditions before. They knew how to work in them, how to stay safe, how to keep making progress even when conditions seemed impossible. Finally, everything was ready. They said goodbye to the ship's crew and set out onto the Antarctic ice, pulling their sledges behind them. The ice here was different from the Arctic. Harder, colder, more ancient. The glaciers flowed constantly, creating pressure ridges and crevasses that required careful navigation. The temperature rarely rose above zero, even in summer, and the wind was relentless. But the principles were the same. Move carefully, work together, respect the environment, pay attention to every detail. They traveled inland, climbing gradually as the coast fell away behind them. After 3 days, they looked back and could no longer see the ocean. Ahead of them stretched nothing but ice and snow, extending to the horizon and beyond. "How far do you think we'll get?" William asked one evening as they set up camp. Thomas considered this carefully. "As far as we can safely go, not a step further." It was the right answer, the only answer. Polar exploration wasn't about setting records or pushing limits just to prove you could. It was about expanding human knowledge and capability in a measured, thoughtful way.
The ice didn't reward recklessness. They continued south for 2 more weeks, making detailed observations and collecting samples. The landscape was both monotonous and spectacular. Endless ice, broken occasionally by exposed rock or deep crevasses. The cold was intense, even worse than they'd experienced in the Arctic. Several times they had to shelter in their tent for days while storms raged outside. But they kept moving when they could, kept gathering data, kept pushing the boundaries of explored territory just a little bit further. On their 18th day inland, they reached a point that felt right to Thomas, not because they'd achieved some specific goal or reached some predetermined destination, but because going further would start to become reckless. They were at the edge of their safety margin. "This is where we turn back," he said. Margaret and William nodded. They'd learned to trust each other's judgment on the ice, and they trusted Thomas now. They planted a flag and took careful measurements of their position. Then they turned around and began the journey back to the coast. The return journey was faster than the outward journey, partly because they knew the route now, but mostly because they weren't stopping as often to collect samples and make observations. They moved with purpose, covering good distance each day. But the ice had one more lesson to teach them. 3 days from the coast, William broke through. They were crossing what looked like solid snow when suddenly he dropped, the snow giving way beneath him. He caught himself on his elbows, his legs dangling in empty space, the dark opening of a crevasse visible beneath him. Thomas and Margaret reacted instantly, throwing themselves flat to distribute their weight and grabbing William's arms. They pulled him carefully back from the edge, their hearts pounding. William lay on his back for a moment, breathing hard. "That was close," he said finally. "Too close," Margaret agreed. They backed away from the crevasse carefully, roping themselves together for safety. The incident was a sharp reminder that the ice could kill you at any moment, even when you thought you were being careful, even when you had experience and good judgment. They were more cautious after that, testing every step, roping the sledges and themselves together so that if someone fell through, the others could catch them. It slowed their progress, but kept them alive. They reached the coast 4 days later and found the ship waiting as promised. Captain Stevens welcomed them back aboard, and that night they ate a hot meal and slept in actual bunks for the first time in weeks. "Successful expedition?" the captain asked over dinner. Thomas nodded. "Very successful. We've mapped new territory, collected valuable samples, and everyone made it back safely. Can't ask for more than that." The ship began its journey north the next morning.
Thomas stood at the rail as the Antarctic coast disappeared into the distance, committing the landscape to memory. The ice, the cold, the absolute clarity of that frozen world. He didn't know if he'd ever return to Antarctica. Polar exploration was hard on the body, and each expedition took something from you that you never quite got back. But he knew the ice would always be part of him now, would always shape how he saw the world and understood his place in it. They reached England in April, returning to spring and warmth and the familiar chaos of civilization. The expedition was deemed a success by the scientific community. Their samples and observations contributed to the growing body of knowledge about the Antarctic environment. Thomas delivered lectures and wrote articles about their journey, but he found himself talking less about the specific achievements and more about the experience of polar travel itself, the way it tested you, changed you, taught you things about yourself and about human potential that couldn't be learned anywhere else. "Will you go back?" journalists asked him repeatedly. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "The ice has given me everything it can for now. Maybe I'll return to it someday, or maybe I'll find new challenges elsewhere." He stayed in touch with Margaret and William. They would get together occasionally, sharing a drink and swapping stories about their time on the ice. There was a bond between them that was deeper than ordinary friendship, forged in those weeks of shared danger and shared achievement. But they also moved on with their lives. William joined a shipping company that operated in Arctic waters, using his experience to help navigate through ice-choked seas. Margaret became involved in scientific organizations, working to support future expeditions and promote polar research. Thomas found himself drawn to teaching. He took a position at a university, instructing younger people about geography and exploration. He wanted to pass on not just the technical knowledge he'd gained, but also the wisdom, the understanding that true exploration was as much about inner journey as outer journey. One of his students asked him once, "What's the most important thing you learned from your time on the ice?" Thomas thought carefully before answering, "That humans are capable of far more than we typically demand of ourselves. When the situation requires it, when survival depends on it, we can endure incredible hardship and accomplish seemingly impossible things. But it requires respect. Respect for the environment, respect for your companions, respect for your own limitations. The ice teaches humility." "Do you miss it?" the student asked. "Every day," Thomas admitted. "But I also know that the ice isn't something you can hold on to. You can only visit it, learn from it, and then let it go. Trying to possess it would be like trying to own the wind or the cold. It exists beyond human desires." Years passed.
Thomas grew older, his hair graying at the temples, his body showing the long-term effects of those hard months in polar regions. But his memories of the ice remained sharp and clear. He continued teaching, continued writing, continued contributing to the field of polar exploration. He helped plan expeditions for others, offering advice based on his experience. Some of his former students went on to become explorers themselves, carrying forward the knowledge he'd shared with them. Margaret and William visited him occasionally. They were all older now, moving slower, carrying the weight of experience and years. But when they got together, they could still feel it, that connection forged on the ice, that shared understanding of what it meant to push yourself to absolute limits and discover you were stronger than you'd known. One evening, sitting in Thomas's study with William and Margaret, they fell into reminiscing about that first expedition to the Arctic, the journey to the cache that had nearly killed them. "Do you remember the broken ice field?" William asked. "How we thought we might not make it through?" "I remember being certain we wouldn't," Margaret said. "And then we did, because there wasn't any other choice." Thomas nodded. "That's the thing about the ice. It doesn't care about your doubts or fears. It only responds to action.
You either find a way forward or you don't. There's a clarity to that which I've never found anywhere else. Do you ever wish you could go back? William asked. Not as we are now, but as we were then? Young enough and strong enough to do it again? Thomas considered this carefully. No, he said finally. Those experiences shaped me, but I don't need to repeat them. What we did was enough. We proved what we needed to prove, to ourselves if no one else. The ice taught us what we needed to learn. And what was that? Margaret asked. That we're capable of more than we think. That working together, humans can survive in environments that seem designed to kill us. That there's a kind of beauty in extreme simplicity, in reducing life to its most basic elements. Stay warm, stay fed, keep moving forward. They sat in comfortable silence after that, 3 old friends who had shared something extraordinary, who carried those memories like treasures that couldn't be diminished by time. Thomas wrote his memoirs in his 70s, a comprehensive account of his expeditions and what they'd meant to him. The book was well received, praised for its honesty and its avoidance of the typical heroic narratives that often surrounded polar exploration. He wrote about the fear, the doubt, the moments when giving up seemed like the only rational choice. But he also wrote about the determination, the cooperation, the small victories that accumulated into larger achievements. He tried to capture what it actually felt like to travel across the ice, to live in that extreme environment, to push your body and mind to their breaking points.
One section of the book focused specifically on that journey to the cache, the expedition that had tested them so severely. Reading it over after he'd finished writing, Thomas was struck by how vividly he could still recall every detail. The cold, the wind, the sound of the sledge runners, the relief of reaching the cache, the journey back to the ship. It had been decades ago, but it felt like yesterday. Near the end of his life, Thomas received a letter from a young explorer who was planning an expedition to Antarctica. The young man had read Thomas's memoirs and wanted advice. Thomas wrote back with all the wisdom he'd accumulated over his years. He talked about preparation, about equipment, about the importance of choosing the right companions. But he also wrote about the mental aspects of polar travel, the need for patience, for flexibility, for absolute honesty about your capabilities and limitations. The ice will test you in ways you can't anticipate, he wrote. It will show you who you really are, stripped of all pretense and social masks. Accept what you learn about yourself, both the strengths and the weaknesses. And remember that surviving is an achievement in itself. You don't need to set records or accomplish dramatic feats. Simply coming back alive, having experienced that world and learned from it, is enough. He signed the letter and sent it off, wondering if his words would mean anything to someone who hadn't yet experienced what he was describing. Probably not. Some things could only be understood by living through them. Thomas died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. Margaret and William were among the mourners at his funeral, both of them now quite old themselves. The church was full of people whose lives he'd touched, former students, fellow explorers, colleagues and friends. But as Margaret gave the eulogy, she didn't focus on his accomplishments or his contributions to science. Instead, she talked about who he was as a person, his quiet determination, his careful judgment, his absolute reliability when conditions were at their worst. She paused, looking out at the assembled mourners. The ice shaped him, as it shaped all of us who traveled with him. But he also shaped the ice, in a way. He approached it with respect and humility, seeing it not as an enemy to conquer, but as a teacher to learn from. That perspective allowed him to survive where others might have perished, and it allowed him to return from those expeditions, not bitter or broken, but enriched. After the funeral, Margaret and William walked together through the cemetery.
They were both in their 80s now, their bodies worn by age and old injuries, but their minds were still sharp, still full of memories from those extraordinary years on the ice. He was right, you know, William said, about the clarity of it. Nothing else in my life has ever been as clear, as pure, as those weeks we spent traveling to the cache and back. Margaret nodded. I've thought about that journey every day since it happened. Not because it was particularly dramatic or heroic, but because it showed me what I was capable of. It set a standard for the rest of my life. They stood in silence for a moment, remembering their friend, remembering the ice, remembering who they'd been in that frozen wilderness so many years ago. Do you think anyone will understand? William asked. When they read about our expeditions, when they study what we did, will they truly understand what it was like?
Some will, Margaret said. The ones who go to those places themselves, who feel the cold and see the endless white and push themselves to their limits. They'll understand. And the others? They'll think they understand. They'll imagine adventure and heroism and dramatic moments. They'll miss the truth, which was simpler and harder and more profound than any story can capture. They left the cemetery as the sun was setting, two old explorers carrying their memories like precious cargo, guarding the truth of their experiences against the simplifications that time and distance always impose. Decades later, in a new century, explorers still traveled to the polar regions. They used modern equipment, sophisticated technology, GPS navigation, satellite communication. The ice was still dangerous, but many of the unknowns had been mapped, many of the risks reduced. But the fundamental experience remained the same: the cold, the isolation, the absolute necessity of good judgment and cooperation, the way the ice stripped away everything unnecessary and showed you who you really were. Thomas's memoirs remained in print, read by new generations of explorers and adventurers. His words spoke across the years, offering wisdom earned through hard experience on the ice. The specific details of his expeditions became less relevant as technology advanced, but the underlying truths remained constant. "The ice doesn't care about your technology or your plans," he'd written. "It only cares about whether you respect it enough to survive it." Groups still made journeys similar to the one Thomas, Margaret, and William had undertaken, pulling sledges across the ice, navigating around obstacles, racing against diminishing supplies. They faced the same challenges, learned the same lessons, discovered the same truths about human capability and limitation. And sometimes, when the wind was right, and the cold was intense, and the ice stretched endlessly in all directions, these modern explorers would think about the people who had come before them. Thomas and his companions.
All the others who had walked these frozen paths, who had learned from the ice, who had returned changed by the experience. The ice remembered them all, in its way. Every footstep ever taken across its surface was eventually erased, but the ice itself remained, eternal and indifferent, waiting for the next person brave enough or foolish enough to venture onto its surface and test themselves against its absolute standards. As soon as the dawn became paler, the travelers moved forward, attentive in the snow. This is where it had all begun, with that simple act of continuing forward despite the cold, despite the uncertainty, despite all the rational reasons to stop or turn back. One step, then another, adding up to miles and then to journeys, and then to lives lived fully in the service of exploration and discovery. Thomas had understood this better than most. Progress wasn't about dramatic leaps or heroic moments. It was about the daily grind, the steady application of effort, the refusal to give up even when giving up would be easier. He'd written near the end of his memoir, "People often ask what I'm most proud of for my time exploring the polar regions. They expect me to name some specific achievement, a distance covered, a record set, a scientific discovery made. But what I'm actually most proud of is simpler. We survived. All of us, every member of every expedition I was part of, made it home alive. That might not sound like much, but on the ice, it's everything." That was his legacy. Not the miles mapped or the samples collected, but the wisdom he'd gained and passed on. The understanding that survival itself was an achievement, that caution was a form of courage, that working together was more important than individual heroism. The ice had taught him well, and he'd been a good student. If you enjoyed this story of survival, perseverance, and the quiet triumph of the human spirit against nature's harshest conditions, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of exploration, endurance, and the extraordinary journeys that test the limits of human capability. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that will transport you to the world's most extreme environments and the people who dared to explore them.